process. And I also want to talk about at the end a really unique opportunity that we have this year regarding ARPA and ARPA funds. And that's something that I don't think anybody has heard before, whereas the stuff around how DHCD operates and what our processes are, I think might be, if you guys have been to any of these trainings before, you guys might have heard this already. So I just want to note that I will be kind of going through our process, but I'm going to try to save as much time as I can to get to the end and really talk about ARPA, because that's really new and exciting and a great opportunity. All right, so let me just, as you guys probably know, DHCD, Department of Housing and Community Development, is structured into, the Division of Public Housing is structured into two main bureaus. We have housing management and we have the housing development and construction. Housing management works with, you guys might be more familiar, you have a housing management specialist who talks to you as a board member, or maybe they talk to you as a resident, and they definitely talk to the housing authorities about how things are going and having some specific, performance metrics that we really like to encourage all of our housing authorities to have. While most of the reports that you guys might see fall under the housing management scope, capital improvement plans fall under the purview of the Bureau of Housing Development and Construction. And for those who don't know, capital in this case is meant to mean large construction projects. So the Bureau of Housing Development and Construction is made up of three main units: project management. Here, I'm going to do a little laser pen so you can follow along here. Project management, right? We have a unit of architects and engineers that are all in-house and licensed, and then we have a unit of construction advisors who work with housing authorities and designers on site when construction is actually happening. Every LHA has an assigned person from each unit dedicated to helping it implement any of the construction projects. Housing authorities should be really familiar with their teams and are in constant contact throughout the lifespan of any construction project. Another group who really do help both in construction and help the housing authorities themselves are the RCATS, also known as the Regional Capital Assistance Teams. Housing authorities that have under 500 units are eligible to be part of the RCAT program and get an assigned RCAT. The RCATs themselves deploy an additional team to help the housing authorities implement their capital projects that are under $100,000. So the RCATs are the ones who manage those projects. They do the construction for those projects. They're really, really involved for any kind of project that's between $10,000 and $100,000. So the RCAT teams, especially for the smaller housing authorities, are really critical to creating their capital plans, as well as critical to implementing their construction projects. It's because the RCATs also help LHAs put together their CIPs and serve as a resource during the plan creation process. And there are 3 RCAT teams that each cover their own geographic area. As you can see, we have Central West, and those are the green housing authorities. We have the Northeast, and those are the blue, right? Blue's housing authorities. And then we have the Southeast, which are the lovely orange. And you can see like a little rogue orange person up there in the Northeast territory. But for the most part, they're really, really well organized in terms of their regions and how they support the housing authorities. So I know I mentioned CIP. Of course, we're at the state, we love our acronyms, but a CIP stands for a capital improvement plan. It's an annual plan that housing authorities submit, and it tells DHCD exactly which projects they want to initiate in this year. The annual plan, the capital plan itself is a 1-year and 3-year plan. And so when they submit it, they say, this is the group of projects we want to make active this year. And then these are the projects that we want to have in our queue or be on the radar for the next 2 to 3 years, so that we are not hopefully as surprised, unless an emergency comes up, we're not really surprised at what the pipeline will look like in terms of construction projects. The CIP itself is a tool that we developed so that we can kind of collaborate most effectively with housing authorities, and we can work together to make sure that the most critical projects are the ones being implemented. Ultimately, a completed CIP is a 5-year plan. Although just to mention, we do like kind of note the 1-year and 3-year plans, because those are the most imminent plans that we tend to look at. But we look at the planning scope, like how big of a project it is, how long it will last in construction, the schedule, and then of course the budget. And part of the budget is identifying the different kinds of funding sources that are needed. An approved CIP is required in order to utilize any of our funding. So knowing how a CIP works is really, really critical. So one of the things is you're kind of orienting yourself to how DHCD in general works. Is there's 2 types of funding. There's capital funds, otherwise known as construction funds. They support construction projects at the LHA's building and sites. And really, if you think about, these are the large projects, roof replacements, pavings, windows, etc. Housing authorities also have operating funds, and these operating funds support the day-to-day work. For example, maintenance and upkeep, snow removal, gutter cleaning. One of the good ways to kind of think about the difference between capital funds and operating funds is that operating funds support the light bulb, whereas capital funds kind of support the whole lighting fixture and do those kinds of replacements. So if you want to know where these funding streams come from, capital funds are funded through the Commonwealth's annual budget. It's the capital bond budget that is passed every year. It's a specific budget just for capital projects. The spending is planned and allocated by agencies within the Office of Administration and Finance. And that office reports to the governor. The bond cap, which is what we refer to internally as how much we have for capital projects. It's funded by long-term bonds that are repaid with tax revenue that the Commonwealth receives through the operating budget. And by operating budget here, they mean the Commonwealth legislative operating budget. In fiscal year 2020, the administration allocated DHCD's public housing division $109.5 million in capital funds to preserve and modernize our housing authorities across the Commonwealth. And in the following slides, I'll show how exactly we manage those bonds, the bond cap as a whole, and different ways that funding can happen. Just as a note, the operating funds that I mentioned before are appropriated each year through an annual budget process. They're dispersed to housing authorities based on overall funding levels and allowable expenses, and that includes an assessment of net rents. And operating funds are funded by current fiscal year taxes. It's a very, very separate and different funding stream than the capital funds. And in fiscal year 2020, the Commonwealth budget provided for $72 million in operating subsidy for local housing authorities. Just to give you a sense, funding levels over time. As you can see, we have been given increasingly more funds, especially since 2019. We've been going up. A lot of these, one of the reasons why 2021 and 2022 is not on this list is just because COVID has thrown us off a lot in terms of how much money is being spent over time, especially when we shut down. It really threw all of our metrics off. And so one of the things that we've been doing is kind of making up for last time, and we've been able to spend a lot more in the last year and a half, and those numbers are still coming in. One of the main vehicles for us to fund construction projects at the housing authorities is through a funding stream that we call formula funding. It's an housing authorities share of our bond cap. It's allocated on an annual basis. And for example, in fiscal year 20, formula funding is budgeted for 52.5 million. So about half of our total bond cap went to formula funding allocations. The amount of formula funding that an LHA receives is based on their need and the size of their portfolio. So we have a system, an actual IT system, like a software system that logs in and assesses all of the different components that need to be updated. And we look at how, like, when components are supposed to fail. Like, so the CPS, where it says the need is determined based on the condition of the LHA's existing buildings as reported in our capital planning system. And every 5 years, we procure a statewide facility conditions assessment to inform how we need to allocate our formula funding. CPS catalogs the condition of every building and site in the state portfolio, and housing authorities update CPS as projects are completed. So CPS kind of has an estimate of when how long a certain construction project is supposed to kind of be effective. So you guys know, for example, roofs tend to last 20 years, sometimes 30 years, depending on all of the materials that are involved. And so in CPS, if there is a roof project, the contractor and designer say, okay, this roof should last 20 years. And so it's updated in CPS, so that it has an assessment. It has like a general idea of how long our various capital components should last. And we use that, we rely really heavily on that to best determine how much annually formula funding every housing authority might need. A CIP, our capital improvement plan, will focus mostly on formula funding spending, and LHA's program their formula funding allowance through their CIP. They apply for competitive funds in a different process. So if you look at the bond cap itself, right, all of the awards, that this is like the total amount of money that DHCD gets. 58% goes to formula funding, 9% is allocated towards special unique awards, 23% are the competitive awards, and the admin covers 10%, no more than 10% of the total bond cap. So when you're looking at a capital plan, it starts off, of course, with the housing authority identifying all the projects that they want to complete in the next 5 years, and then the housing authority prioritizes each project. Again, what needs to happen immediately, and then what needs to be happening kind of within the next 3 years, and of course, queuing up everything in a 5-year process. The projects are arranged in the CIP based on their priority and cost. Hopefully those with the highest priority will be entered in the earliest start dates than those with a lower priority. And if any of the reviewers have any questions about priorities, we definitely reach out to housing authorities and kind of have those conversations offline where we can make sure that as best we can, that the highest priority projects can be addressed. And it's within the CIP itself that the funding sources for each project is identified. When the CIP is approved, an approval email is sent out and an LHA can begin work. It's only through this approval process that there is a way for the housing authority to even bill for projects. And so it's only when projects are approved that they can actually start. DHCD's CIP review process, we review the CIPs for 3 main things: to ensure that the housing authority has appropriately prioritized their projects. So, for example, a leaking roof would take precedence over maybe some landscaping or what might be kind of more cosmetic upgrades. We also want to ensure that the housing authority plans to spend within their formula funding limits. So we ask that they spend at least 80% of what they are allocated, and they are not allowed to spend more than what's available within their 5-year period. Just as a caveat, one of the reasons we say that LHA should spend a minimum of 80% is that some LHAs kind of think about it as they trying to save up over time, like, thinking of it as their own account. They are, sometimes have been concerned to spend all of the amounts that they're given within their formula funds. And what we try to tell them is, no, this is exactly what we're really, really wanting you to spend, all of the formula funding that we give you. And in the most recent, like 3 or 4 years, I mean, especially since COVID, we haven't had any issues really with housing authorities meeting their 80% benchmark. The other reason that we review the CIP is to review any special award requests. And there's a lot of special award requests, and I will go into those shortly. The people within DHCD who review a CIP are the architects and or engineers to make sure that the project is kind of scoped adequately and that all the components that are needed are there. And then the project manager finalizes it and approves it based on the schedule and the budget. Board involvement is really critical. The CIPs need the board approval before we can review and approve the final iteration of the CIP. So an executive director will likely present a scenario spreadsheet at a board meeting for your review. And this spreadsheet is generated by the CIP system, and it lays out the timeline and spending projections for the projects the LHA has selected. So as you can see, in this example, right, you have year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and 5. As a project manager and the architects and engineers, they look primarily at these projects that are in year 1. And then as you can see, for example, this kitchen and bath project, it's estimated to span over 2 fiscal years. And so we definitely look at what does that look like? Does the housing authority have sufficient funds to make sure that the project happens when it needs to happen? And so we spend a lot of time when we look at these spreadsheets to really assess year 1 and tertiarily year 2 spending, right? And then you can see kind of out here, these are the projects that we know are kind of also a high priority and are coming down the pipe. But we know that right now they might not have enough funds to be able to support like another septic sewer project, while we are having this large project of kitchen and baths. And so we really do kind of try to portion it out and manage it over a 5-year period. Both the CIP report submissions and competitive funding applications need to be presented to the residents for comments and questions. And a letter from the head of the resident organization or representative of residents needs to be submitted, and it demonstrates the evidence of compliance with our participation regulations. And so this letter needs to be provided with each CIP and competitive funding application submission, which means that the executive director or mod director at your housing authority should be talking with residents on an ongoing basis about what their spending plan is around construction projects. And so a quick example of the formula funding projects, as you can see, this was in Lawrence, and this was before we did a huge site improvement. And this was after. You can see that the formula funding has been able to make a big difference at a lot of different locations. And I think this might be, this is still Lawrence. And so you can see like before it was a very unused field. And so we paved it and created a playground, which was really, really fun. Some examples of our funding streams besides formula funding. We have a compliance reserve that is used to help projects comply with laws, codes, and regulations. For example, projects related to a reasonable accommodation request made by tenants or asbestos and lead remediation. These are fully covered by our compliance reserve. We also have emergency funds reserves. So when an LHA has completely depleted their formula funding, but an emergency situation arises that cannot wait for their next year's allocation, they apply for emergency funds. We also have sustainability funds, and it's for projects that improve energy efficiency and resiliency at the housing authorities. There are competitive funds as well, right? And so every so often, as funds become available, we issue what we call a NOFA, a Notice of Funding Availability. And so these awards are meant to fund large comprehensive modernization projects They are issued via a public housing notice, also called a PHN, and it outlines the application process, the eligibility process, and our scoring criteria. We also host question and answer sessions for housing authorities before the applications are due, and we publish a transcript of questions asked and answered on our website. Board members need to approve a housing authority's application for competitive funding through a board vote before it can be submitted. And I'm going to follow up with a couple of examples of recent and current funding opportunities. But before I go there, I really do want to take some time to give a quick overview of ARPA, which is a very unique kind of funding situation. So you guys might have heard about the American Rescue Plan Act, the federal government, and Massachusetts itself received $5.2 billion from that act. So on December 13th of 2021, Governor Baker signed legislation appropriating up to $2.5 billion of the uncommitted ARPA funds, as well as $1.5 billion in state fiscal year surplus dollars. And it was included $600 million for housing. And so public housing, our side of the shop, was allocated $150 million for preservation and modernization. 21 housing authorities were also awarded earmarks from the ARPA bill from their legislators, totaling $3,654,000. That is over and above the $150 million that we got in our allocations. So there is still $2 billion in unallocated ARPA funding to obligate by the end of June 2024, and Governor Baker's next spending bill is expected within the coming months. So as you can see, the ARPA bill, the ARPA funds have provided us with a really unique opportunity to really try to dedicate funds to some of our most critically needed public housing units. So just so you know where we plan to spend our ARPA funds, right? We wanted to give housing authorities just an extra award to spend as they will and as they need to. I'll go into this a little bit more later, but as you guys probably know, COVID had a huge impact on the cost of supplies and the cost of labor. So since COVID has happened, we've seen a huge increase in the cost of everything, which has had a huge toll on our allocated funds. And so we wanted to give housing authorities the ability to decide for themselves where a huge portion of that $150 million will go to in their own portfolio. We also are going to be using $93 million towards targeted awards. And I will explain a little bit more about what those targeted awards will look like. We also are using around $1.5 million to staff all of these additional projects. As you can tell, it's going to have a huge influx a huge influx of projects, and so we are going to need additional staff to help us deal with it. So we have gotten permission to have temporary positions of 2 years to really help manage the flow of these funds. So one of the things that like I said, that we are giving housing authorities is what we're calling the ARPA Formula Funding Award. So that means that every housing authority will receive, and actually has received as of last week, an additional award equal to the amount of their last formula funding award. It does not replace their next funding award. So it literally is an extra year's worth of funding. And so they're meant to supplement existing and future formula funding and not replace it. Basically, when housing authorities are thinking about how they want to use this particular funding stream, the same rules apply as what they would was their normal formula funding, and it must be spent on just capital expenses. One thing to keep in mind is that these funds, ARPA funds, do need to be spent by June 30th of 2024. So we're really strongly encouraging housing authorities to spend these dollars as quickly as possible. Targeted ARPA awards, which is the other component, is a new process that we're using to assess an entire portfolio across the Commonwealth for the condition of particular The assessment allows us to catalog the conditions, identify and prioritize developments where the condition is most critical, and make direct funding awards to address the components. So, for example, about a year and a half ago, we piloted this approach with a septic system program. It allowed us to identify 19 septic systems that were on the verge of failure. We were able to replace them before a complete failure. And so what we did was we went into CPS and said which components, which septic systems in this example, are about to fail. And we also contracted with an engineer to go around and survey housing authorities themselves and do an assessment across the whole Commonwealth to see where the biggest priorities are for replacing septic systems. And so instead of waiting for housing authorities to identify it as a failing effort, we were able to proactively go out and say, okay, these are critical needs, and we want to spend concerted amount of dollars to support that. So we decided to use a similar approach for the ARPA awards. So what we decided was to really target fire alarm systems, any existing fire alarm systems that are very out of date. We wanted to make sure that those are updated, and we wanted to really address any federal specific electrical panels that still exist in housing authorities. There have been a lot of studies that show that these panels are actually not effective and can sometimes be hazardous. And so we wanted to make a concerted effort to replace all of those as well. We are looking at also if we have any remaining funds available after these two efforts, because those could be pretty expensive, making sure that our elevators are in good repair. And we're also having a set aside amount to support accessible units and increase the amount of accessible units we have across the Commonwealth. So if housing authorities are looking at how they can access the funds, we go into CPS and make sure, this is where we do our assessment of where the components are about to fail or might be about to expire. And we set up a prioritization list, and then we hire someone to go out and take this list to go out into, again, the field, which would be the whole state, across the state, to really assess and make sure that, like, what this fire alarm system really look like, and again, where do these federal Pacific panels exist, and then we, from that assessment, create projects, targeted projects. And the last bucket of funds that we're going to be using is, of course, like I said, temporary DHCD staff. And that would be, we're having a new project manager, one new architect, one new electrical engineer, a new construction advisor, and a new accountant, because we all know that these funds, are going to be flying through, and we're going to need all the help we can, both administratively and in the field, to make sure that these projects are moving. And right, as I said before, they are 2-year positions. The project manager, architect, and engineer positions have already been posted, and are currently we're currently interviewing for those positions. And the construction advisor and accountant will be hired in 1 to 1.5 years once most of the projects are actually in construction. So housing authorities, in terms of the timelines, right, for this funding, housing authorities are currently filling out their formula funding proposals. The deadline is June 30th. And so housing authorities right now are in the process of working with their RCATS, with their project managers to kind of attribute their, what we're calling the formula funding, ARPA amounts, in the best way possible. The targeted projects are currently being scoped and will begin next fiscal year. And then the temporary positions, like I said, are posted and will start as soon as the hiring process allows. One of the things to keep in mind with ARPA funds is that they have to be spent by June 30th of 2024. So there really is an urgency with getting these projects kind of identified and started. And one of the things, I mentioned this before, but one of the things that you guys should know when we talk about these extra funds is that there has been a significant inflation in the cost of doing this work. And so unfortunately, we're anticipating that the ARPA funds are mostly going to be used to supplement these escalating costs. In June of 2021, DHCD hired a construction cost estimator to update our component costs in CPS. And it showed that from 2019 to 2021, construction costs increased by an average of 62%. And as you know, like for a lot of these projects, these critical projects like roofing, right? It increased 113%. Fire pump systems, furnaces, double hung windows, all like critical components the costs for each of these have gone up. So one of the things, as we're looking at how ARPA funds are used, in addition to how our existing funds are used, we're really conscious of the fact that these dollars aren't going to go as far as we would like them to go because of these increased costs. And I also just want to note that we would never have gotten these ARPA funds if it hadn't been for the advocacy of housing authorities, tenants, residents, board members. If that advocacy had not happened, we would never have gotten these funds to support the actual work in the units and at the development. So we really do thank you for all of your efforts on our behalf, and we are grateful for our partnership. These last several slides are just other examples of competitive funding opportunities that we have available. And I'm going to go through them really quickly because I do think that you guys probably have a lot of questions about what I've already been talking about. So just really quickly, and again, I'm going to share these slides, and so you will be able to get a much better example. Like we can read these in more detail at your leisure. But HILAPP is a program that we have that is competitive, and it's when housing authorities have gotten other dollars like maybe CDBG money or CPA funds. Sometimes local towns would give money. And so when those happen, the housing authority can apply for HILAPP dollars, and we leverage, we basically, for every dollar that, for example, the town might give, we give $2.50 of HILAPP funds, and it can support any project for any kind of construction project. And it really is to just leverage other funds that housing authorities are able to bring into the process. We have a MODPHASE program. It's called Modernizing Public Housing and Supporting Elders Initiative. And it's specifically for to preserve some of our highest needs within like our 667 or our senior public housing. And it creates partnerships between housing authorities and local service providers to provide a service-rich environment. And these grants are very comprehensive. They are kitchen and bathroom improvements. They're comprehensive system replacements so it like would change over a complete electrical, fire, plumbing, HVAC systems. So they're very, very comprehensive, and they are usually multi-million-dollar projects. And we also have had accessible unit initiatives, although we haven't had as much funding in the most recent couple of years as we would like to be able to increase our accessible units. And then we have very, very large projects like public housing innovations. It's a separate pot of funds where we can have partnerships. Like, for example, PIHO is capital grants to redevelop state public housing and kind of redevelop it as mixed income development. So it could be market housing that's mixed in with state public housing. So right now we have an example of this in Chelsea and in Somerville, and I think there are more applications coming in. We also have what we call Gateway Cities revitalization efforts. And we are, and these are very, very broad economic development opportunities that exist for some of our gateway city housing authorities. And again, I know I just ran through all of those really quickly, but I know you have tons of questions that I want to get to, so feel free. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can have more of a conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Stefanie. That is a ton of great information. I have seen questions from Joella, Gwenerva, and Lisa so far in the chat. So I'm going to go through in that order. If others have questions, please do feel free to add them to the chat, or you can raise your electronic hand. If you look on the bottom of the screen, I think it's in more. Oh, I'm going to mute Joella just a second. Oh, that's not the problem. I'm not sure who the problem is. If you can find your electronic hand on the bottom and raise that, that's another way to ask a question. But let's go to Joella for now. And could you say your name and housing authority before you ask your question?
Well, hi, my name is Joella Tarbudden-Springfield. They call me Jada. I'm almost afraid